Hey heroes, and welcome to another nocturnal episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelade. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. This week's tale begins in a dimension known as the Mindscape, a plane of existence that borders the minds of every sentient being in the universe. This ethereal realm was home to a myriad of different species and entities, including a benevolent semi-humanoid race known as the Sleepwalkers, who patrolled and protected the Mindscape, as well as the denizens of the physical universe who were connected to it. You see, while the Mindscape could be used to access the minds of mortals, such an intrusion had the potential to cause irreparable damage to the victim, driving them mad. As such, the Sleepwalkers made a vow to never invade the mind of another, and promised to do their utmost to prevent others from doing so as well. In this quest, the Sleepwalkers utilized portable devices called Imaginators, which they wore as amulets and used to teleport themselves and others to any location within the Mindscape that they could imagine. The Sleepwalkers were capable of flying, or at least hovering, but the speed with which they could move through the air was pretty limited. In addition to superhuman strength and durability, the visual acuity of each Sleepwalker was beyond that of most other races, allowing them to see wavelength, colors, and forms of energy that would be invisible to humans. Furthermore, each Sleepwalker possessed the ability to project something called warp beams from their eyes, allowing them to reshape physical matter. Of course, prolonged use would diminish the beam's effectiveness until the user rested to recover their strength. As a general rule, the Sleepwalkers were forbidden from using these warp beams on a living creature directly, since doing so could result in permanent mental damage to the target. Instead, they typically warped the environment or other objects to restrain aggressive entities. Once a target was subdued, a Sleepwalker would typically use their Imaginator to teleport the aggressor to a corner of the Mindscape where they would be unable to harm anyone else. Among the various entities that the Sleepwalkers clashed with, there was a recurring foe who we will refer to as Cobweb, although his true name is apparently unpronounceable to humans. An ancient demon, Cobweb was repeatedly thwarted by a particular Sleepwalker, one whose true name is also unknown, but going forward we shall simply refer to as the Sleepwalker. Meanwhile, on Earth there was a young man by the name of Rick Sheridan. The son of William and Florence Sheridan and older brother of Leah Sheridan, Rick was a film student in his second year at Metropolitan University in New York City, and dated a psychology major by the name of Alyssa Conover. He worked as a building superintendent for an elderly couple, Morris and Ida Epstein, who provided him with a room in their Brooklyn tenement where he lived with his pet dog, Rambo. Overall, a fairly ordinary existence, but then one day, in the Mindscape, the demonic Cobweb decided to lure the Sleepwalker into a trap, and it just so happens that Rick's mind was the one he used. Using a decoy to feign an attack on Rick Sheridan, Cobweb tricked his foe into jumping into action to stop him, and when the Sleepwalker became entangled in the demon's trap, Cobweb forced him into Rick's mind. Having never before inhabited the mind of another, the Sleepwalker found his new surroundings to be quite different from the Mindscape he knew. Furthermore, when he attempted to use his Imaginator, he inadvertently manifested within Rick's dreams, since the device was naturally drawn to areas of increased mental activity. Not wanting to cause the boy undue stress, the Sleepwalker attempted to return to the Mindscape. However, Rick's dream self believed the alien to be a monster of some kind, and in his panic he grabbed the Sleepwalker's imaginator before he could use it again. The device disappeared from Rick's hand in a flash of light, after which it was found and retrieved by Cobweb. As a result of all this, the Sleepwalker was effectively bound to Rick, trapped within his mind while he was conscious, but whenever Sheridan slept, the Sleepwalker found that he was able to manifest on Earth. Despite finding himself in an unfamiliar world, the Sleepwalker was still a protector of the innocent, and he used his otherworldly powers to apprehend a group of gun-wielding human criminals who had broken into a warehouse and threatened the life of a security guard, Frank Baylor. Said guard then described what he saw to both the authorities and local reporters, and when Rick saw the news the following day, he recognized the police sketch as the creature from his dream. Furthermore, when Rick later fell asleep next to his girlfriend Alyssa, she saw the Sleepwalker appear, and while she didn't realize where it had come from, she immediately woke Rick, causing the alien to fade away again. Deducing that the creature only appeared while he slept and fearing its unknown intentions, Rick endeavored to remain awake indefinitely, but as the days rolled on, his perpetual exhaustion played havoc on pretty much every aspect of his life. Things came to a head when Rick and Alyssa went to buy coffee at a local bodega right before the store was robbed by a pair of street thugs that Rick had previously chased away from his tenement building. The thugs attacked Rick, knocking him unconscious, but this allowed the Sleepwalker to emerge once again, and the alien hero rescued Alyssa from the criminals. When she asked who he was, he simply stated that he was a sleepwalker, but before he could explain further, Rick awakened, and the alien disappeared once more. Remaining distrustful, Rick kept his connection to the creature a secret from Alyssa, and his refusal to sleep began to put a serious strain on their relationship. Whenever he did doze off, the Sleepwalker emerged and continued to fight evildoers, including a costumed criminal known as 8-Ball, whose origins we discussed on the channel before. However, when Rick awakened in the middle of that conflict, the Sleepwalker was drawn back into his mind, and the police, seeing the peculiar creature fade away as the 8-Ball made his escape, mistakenly believed the two to be in cahoots. Learning about this, Rick was more convinced than ever that the Sleepwalker was a menace, but this situation finally came to a head when he fell asleep, and instead of taking his opportunity to manifest in reality, the Sleepwalker appeared to Rick in his dreams once again. This time, the Sleepwalker began to explain his origins and intentions by sharing his memories. However, Rick's confusion about whether or not he was dreaming caused a mental image of Cobweb to attack him, turning the dream into a nightmare. Becoming more lucid, Rick summoned mental images of various heroes to defend himself, and while these Dreamland duplicates also attacked the Sleepwalker, Sheridan ultimately seized control of his dream, transforming the setting into an ethereal cinema and forcing the heroes to sit and watch the rest of Sleepwalker's story with him. In the end, Rick realized that he had misunderstood the Sleepwalker entirely, and the two came to an understanding. Rick, of course, stopped depriving himself of sleep, and when he did slumber at night, the Sleepwalker was free to roam the city and protect the people of Brooklyn from violent criminals. There were occasional issues, like when Rick agreed to participate in a sleep experiment that his girlfriend Alyssa was involved with. He attempted to warn Sleepwalker not to emerge until he gave the all-clear, but their inability to communicate outside of the dreamscape led to a misunderstanding. And while Sleepwalker avoided being seen, a lab assistant named Nelson Gruber, aka Bookworm, took notice of the peculiar electrical impulses that resulted from his emergence. In an attempt to recreate and amplify these readings, Bookworm inadvertently caused a power surge that endowed him with the ability to summon dreamlike apparitions from anything he read. He attempted to use this power for personal gain and petty vengeance until he was stopped by Sleepwalker and ultimately arrested. Not wanting to risk creating more supervillains, Rick backed out of the sleep experiment entirely, which in turn caused Alyssa to break up with him for wasting her time and effort, although they did ultimately stay friends. After that, Sleepwalker continued to have nocturnal adventures, including one in which he teamed up with Spider-Man to battle a gangster known as Crime Wave. During the first crisis involving the Infinity Gauntlet, in which the Mad Titan Thanos erased half of all life in the universe, Rick was one of those who disappeared, and Sleepwalker, freed as a result, endeavored to protect innocent civilians in the chaos. In the midst of this, Sleepwalker encountered a group of criminals called the Chain Gang, a foursome of escaped convicts who possessed superhuman powers as long as they were chained together. This group's members included Masterlink, who had superhuman strength, Missing Link, who could teleport, Uplink, who could manipulate various forms of energy, and Weak Link, who could drain the energy of other living things. With the cosmic upheaval causing dimensional rifts to randomly open, Sleepwalker was able to imprison the Chain Gang in the Mindscape, but with the city still in chaos, he opted to return to Earth in an attempt to save more lives. In any event, he was ultimately returned to Rick's mind when Nebula used the Infinity Gauntlet to undo the damage that Thanos had done. Sleepwalker had other adventures, not all of which we're going to touch on here, and his exploits ended up significantly decreasing the amount of crime in the Brooklyn area, prompting NYPD detective Cecilia Perez to allow him some leeway. However, his presence garnered the attention of a federal agency called the Office of Insufficient Evidence, or O.I.E. And when a mutant criminal named Lullaby used her hypnotic voice to hold an entranced Rick Sheridan hostage, forcing Sleepwalker to commit robberies and battle the authorities on her behalf, Perez had no choice but to turn her investigation over to the O.I.E. This was despite the fact that Sleepwalker ultimately defeated a Lullaby and turned her over to the police along with everything he'd stolen. Setting up a base of operations in Prospect Park, armored O.I.E. agents accosted and harassed the people of Brooklyn, breaking into the homes of citizens who had interacted with Sleepwalker and questioning them. To track their target, the agents utilized devices that could detect Sleepwalker's unique energy signature, which they identified from residual radiation left at locations he had been seen. Meanwhile, a dejected Sleepwalker began to feel like his presence was a danger to humanity and considered remaining in Rick's mind, but while he was there, he was confronted by an aspect of Rick's personality, a manifestation of his spirit of adventure, who convinced Sleepwalker that running away from his problems wasn't the answer. Sleepwalker then confronted the O.I.E. agents and their commanding officer, Colonel Tolliver Smith, while the denizens of Brooklyn cheered the alien hero on in the hopes that he could repel the unwanted government agents. In the end, Sleepwalker realized that the only way to get them to leave the community alone was to surrender and go with them, and while he did so, he was subsequently rescued by another hero with ties to Brooklyn, the Danny Ketch Ghost Rider, who destroyed much of O.I.E.'s equipment. In the wake of that incident, Detective Cecilia Perez, a Brooklynite herself, petitioned the courts for an injunction against the O.I.E. and ultimately won, forbidding them from further field operations. However, Smith continued to search for ways to apprehend Sleepwalker. Meanwhile, Sleepwalker joined forces with Ghost Rider, Spider-Man, and the Hulk in a battle against the Sinister Six, and defended Rick Sheridan's mind from the Dream Demon Nightmare. For the next part of our story, however, we will turn our attention towards a scientist named Charles Warren Fong, who created a unique synthetic diamond capable of converting white light into colored beams with peculiar effects. Fong's lab assistant, Selena Slate, intended on having her boyfriend, Garth, break into the lab and steal the diamond, but when the crook attempted to do so, he was caught and driven off by Sleepwalker. Sleepwalker then befriended Dr. Fong, who showed him the diamond and demonstrated what it could do, producing green beams that created optical illusions, orange ones that could burn through solid steel, and blue beams that could freeze anything they were shined on. However, the light coming from the crystal proved to have a unique, mind-altering effect on the Sleepwalker. Growing increasingly addicted to this after several nights of exposure, the Sleepwalker convinced an aspect of Rick's mind to put Rick to sleep during the day so that the Sleepwalker could return to Fong's lab and gaze into the diamond once again. At the same time, Garth broke into the lab, attempting to steal the diamond at gunpoint, and in the ensuing chaos, Selena simply seized the crystal herself while it was still connected to the lab's power grid. As a result, Selena Slate was endowed with the diamond's rainbow power, transforming her into a superhuman known as Spectra, the Mistress of Light. She subsequently abandoned her boyfriend who wanted to sell the diamond for drug money, and when she got into a battle with Sleepwalker, she realized that he was also an addict and escaped by blasting him with enough light to leave him in a confused, inebriated state. Meanwhile, Rick awakened, once again pulling the Sleepwalker back into his mind, but this time the Sleepwalker forced his way back out, inadvertently putting Rick into a coma. Realizing what he'd done, Sleepwalker snapped out of his stupor and went back to Dr. Fong for help. Rick was brought to a hospital where he was visited by Alyssa, his immediate family, and Sleepwalker, who returned to Rick's mind when he briefly awakened. Amidst this whole experience, Sleepwalker discovered that extended periods in the physical world left him weakened, and that he could restore his strength by returning to Rick's mind. Meanwhile, the O.I.E. director, Tolliver Smith, and his enforcers, the Thought Police, enlisted the aid of the Fantastic Four's Reed Richards in their quest to capture Sleepwalker. Having a good relationship with the government and wanting to question Sleepwalker himself, Reed agreed to track the alien's energy signature across dimensions on the condition that he be allowed to lead the expedition. Of course, the Thought Police immediately tried to subdue and capture Sleepwalker once again, and when Reed learned that they had inadvertently intruded into a human mind, he tried to pull the plug on the mission. In the end, the Sleepwalker defended both himself and Rick from the unwelcome invaders, ultimately driving them out of Rick's mind. The Fantastic Four used their government connections to ensure that Tolliver Smith and his Office of Insufficient Evidence were well and truly finished. And Rick awakened from his coma to be greeted by the relieved faces of his parents and sister. After all of that, Rick met a woman named Janine and, unaware that she was his landlord's granddaughter, started romancing her. Sleepwalker's reputation, meanwhile, slowly grew as he continued to fight alongside other heroes, and during the Infinity War, when the evil Magus placed the people of Earth into a trance-like state, the Sleepwalker aided Professor X, Jean Grey, Psylocke, and Moondragon by acting as a conduit for their telepathic powers, allowing them to awaken the population. In the wake of that incident, Sleepwalker realized that there might be more times in which he was needed. He proposed to Rick that he accept their partnership as permanent so that he could summon him by closing his eyes and concentrating rather than needing to fall completely asleep first. However, that would also allow Sleepwalker to exit his mind without permission, and Rick was unwilling to surrender more of his freedom. Sleepwalker was subsequently one of many heroes whose morals allowed him to be manipulated by being known as the Goddess during her Infinity Crusade, and briefly operated as a member of Doctor Strange's loosely knit Secret Defenders alongside Namorita and the Punisher. Meanwhile, Cobweb found the Chain Gang in the Mindscape and decided to use them to finish his old foe once and for all. Using the mind of Rick's dog Rambo as a pathway, Cobweb sent the Chain Gang back to Earth and tasked them with killing Rick Sheridan. With his life threatened, Rick tried to do what Sleepwalker suggested earlier, closing his eyes and summoning him. However, Sleepwalker had been injured in a battle with 8-Ball just prior to this, and the two inadvertently merged into a single entity. Despite this, they ultimately succeeded in defeating the Chain Gang once again, weakening their powers by breaking the metal chains that connected them. Furthermore, when Rick lost consciousness, leaving Sleepwalker in sole control of their combined form, the alien hero was able to separate them, but once again something went wrong as Rick's mind was left in Sleepwalker's body, and vice versa. While in Sleepwalker's body, Rick got into a battle with 8-Ball and the Hobgoblin that left him grievously injured and bleeding out when the latter villain slashed his throat. At the same time, unaware of the mind swap, the Chain Gang made another attempt to kill Rick, this time by entering the mind of Alyssa Conover and controlling her. Fortunately, she was able to resist them to some degree when Sleepwalker, in Rick's body, awakened and confessed Rick's love to her. Because of their swap, this awakening pulled the injured Rick into Sleepwalker's mind, meaning that Rick's mind was in Sleepwalker's body, which was inside Sleepwalker's mind, which was in Rick's body. Before we all go cross-eyed thinking about that, I'll say that at this point, Cobweb pulled Sleepwalker's dying body back into the Mindscape with the intention of finishing him off himself. Suffice it to say, he seemed understandably shocked to find that the one he had in his grasp was not his old foe, but Rick Sheridan. Furthermore, while Rick soon learned that a physical injury didn't exactly mean much in the Mindscape, Cobweb cast him deeper into his realm, where he encountered bizarre entities like paranoia, manic, depression, bad ideas, and the Agents of Despair. He soon came upon what appeared to be a group of sleepwalkers. However, these individuals were actually Mindspawn, servants of Cobweb who were impersonating Sleepwalker's people as part of a plot to invade the Earth. Cobweb used this opportunity to sow doubt into Rick's mind, making it seem as though the Sleepwalkers were the ones who were planning an invasion, before sending Rick back into Sleepwalker's mind. Fortunately, with Sleepwalker asleep at the time, Rick emerged just in time to stop the mind-controlled Alyssa from murdering Sleepwalker by using his warp beams to temporarily contort her body and render her unconscious. This also caused the Chain Gang to emerge from her mind once again, and they subsequently repaired their chain to restore their full powers. Furthermore, when Sleepwalker awakened without drawing Rick back into his mind, he realized that the energy-manipulating powers of the Chain Gang member Uplink were interfering with their mental bond. This, it seems, was at least partially responsible for their earlier merger and mind swap. In any event, this allowed Rick and Sleepwalker to confront the Chain Gang together, and when Uplink's powers started inadvertently dissolving the walls between dimensions, Sleepwalker convinced him to return he and Rick to their proper bodies so that they could undo the damage. In the end, the restored Sleepwalker restrained and depowered the Chain Gang once again. In the aftermath of all that, it seemed like Sleepwalker would no longer be trapped in Rick's mind whenever he was awake. As such, Rick hoped to get back to a normal life, but found that since he had neglected his duties, his landlords, the Epsteins, decided to replace him as superintendent, giving the job and apartment to their granddaughter Janine. Furthermore, Sleepwalker and Rick were soon forced to re-establish their mental link, as Sleepwalker was unable to persist on the physical plane indefinitely, and without access to mental energy for sustenance, he would eventually die. Rick initially forced him to promise never to emerge from his mind again, but then Cobweb's Mindspawn began their invasion of Earth. Soon the Mindspawn targeted Rick and threatened to kill him. However, Sleepwalker saved his life by pretending to join them and do so himself. In truth, Sleepwalker had pulled Rick's mind out of his body, storing it in a Mindspawn device called a Mind Rake, which put his body into a death-like state. Sleepwalker then challenged and defeated the Mindspawn's apparent leader, Noxkak, in an attempt to seize control of their forces and mitigate the damage. However, the Avengers arrived on the scene soon thereafter and quashed the invasion, forcing the Mindspawn to retreat. Left behind in the confusion, the injured Noxkak was taken by the authorities and held captive at a secret federal prison hospital. While there, however, he was found by a serial killer named Jeremy Romeo Roscoe, who had escaped from his restraints and tried to kill the captive alien. As he did, the Mindspawn fed on Romeo's mental energy, and the two inadvertently merged into a single entity that dubbed itself Psycho. Gaining the power to spread madness and chaos, Psycho battled Sleepwalker and stole the Mind Rake containing Rick's consciousness. While affected by Psycho's powers, Sleepwalker had another encounter with his old foe, Spectra, who blamed him for the Mindspawn invasion, but he eventually convinced her of his good intentions, and she subsequently helped him recover from Psycho's madness and defeat the insane villain. Reclaiming the Mind Rake, he then met with Alyssa Conover with the intention of exhuming Rick Sheridan's body and returning his mind to it. While all that was happening, however, Rick's mind was pulled into the Mindscape, where Cobweb continued to manipulate him so that he could use his mental energies for his own purposes. Harnessing this power, he had several of his Mindspawns possess humans who were in or near the cemetery where Rick was buried, and sent them to stop Sleepwalker from restoring him. Recognizing that these people were possessed by Mindspawn, Sleepwalker attempted to use his warp beams to free them, but Alyssa mistakenly believed that they were regular humans and stopped him with the Mind Rake. As a result, however, Sleepwalker's mind was sent to where Rick's mind was, and he was able to convince him to reject Cobweb's lies and manipulations. Furthermore, Sleepwalker realized that Cobweb had his old Imaginator, and the hero seized it once again, using it to banish the demon to a far-off corner of reality. Cobweb's disappearance also caused the Mindspawn to lose the strength he'd granted to them, and they reverted to their original forms, no longer resembling the Sleepwalkers. Meanwhile, Alyssa also realized that the people who attacked Sleepwalker were actually Mindspawn, and as soon as Cobweb was defeated, the possessed humans were also freed. After that, Sleepwalker's mind emerged from the Mind Rake and returned to his own body on Earth. He then resurrected Rick Sheridan, restoring his mind as well, and of course as soon as Rick awakened, the Sleepwalker returned to his mind as usual. In the wake of these incidents, Rick and Alyssa resumed their relationship and eventually moved in together, with Alyssa finally learning the full truth about Rick's connection with Sleepwalker. Sleepwalker continued to emerge at night to do his thing, but then, during the superhero Civil War, Rick refused to let him get involved in the conflict and laid low while staying awake for as long as possible. After the war, however, Alyssa was involved in a traffic accident and passed away. Unsure of what to do with himself, Rick registered with the federal government's Initiative program, and Sleepwalker was assigned to Carol Danvers' covert strike team, Operation Lightning Storm. During this time, Rick used a sleep induction device that would render him unconscious for 3 hours at a time. However, overuse of the device carried a risk of permanent brain damage. Since then, at the suggestion of Dr. Strange, Rick instead began practicing meditation, allowing him to safely and voluntarily put himself in a state in which he could release the Sleepwalker. In the end, the Sleepwalker might not be the most famous or prolific figure in the Marvel Universe, but he's certainly a unique part of it, and is one hero who definitely shouldn't be slept on. Alright heroes, that's all I've got for you this week, but thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. That being said, if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this weekend, so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!